The bass from Fizz nightclub still thrummed in Sarah's chest as she and Mark stumbled onto the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement of downtown Cullman. The Alabama night air hung thick and humid, carrying the distant hum of interstate traffic and the sweet scent of honeysuckle from the old courthouse square. 10 years, Mark said, loosening his tie. At 34, he still had most of his hair, though Sarah had noticed the gray creeping in at his temples. Can you believe it's been 10 years? Sarah laughed, the sound slightly breathless. The vodka tonics had hit harder than she'd expected. God, I feel ancient. Remember when we used to close down bars every weekend? Now we're in bed by 10:30 watching Netflix. Mark grinned, pulling her close as they walked past the shuttered storefronts. Even at midnight, Cullman wasn't exactly bustling, but it wasn't the sleepy farm town it had been when they were kids. The Starbucks on Main Street stayed open until 11 now, and half the restaurants had Wi-Fi signs in their windows. Tonight was fun, though, Sarah said, leaning into his warmth. When was the last time we actually danced? Your cousin's wedding. You complained about my rhythm for a week. You stepped on my foot 3 times. They'd parked in the lot behind the old Piggly Wiggly, now converted into an antique mall that probably saw more tourist traffic than the rest of downtown combined. The asphalt was cracked and weedy, lit by a single flickering streetlight that cast everything in sickly yellow. Mark fumbled for his keys, then stopped. Sarah felt it too. That electric charge in the air, the same feeling from their dating days when they'd sneak off to park somewhere secluded. You know, he said, voice dropping low, we don't have to go home right away. Mark Thompson, are you suggesting we make out in a parking lot like teenagers? I'm suggesting we celebrate our anniversary properly. He pulled her against him, and she could smell his cologne mixed with beer and cigarette smoke from the club. Besides, when's the last time we did anything spontaneous? Sarah glanced around the empty lot. The antique mall's security light provided just enough illumination to make everything look romantic instead of seedy. What if someone sees us? Who's going to see us? It's midnight on a Tuesday in Cullman, Alabama. Even the cops are probably asleep. She was already letting him guide her toward the darker corner of the lot, behind a row of dumpsters where his Honda sat next to a beaten-up conversion van with Alabama plates. The van looked like it hadn't moved in weeks, its white paint job stained with rust and something darker. Okay, she whispered. But if we get arrested for public indecency, I'm blaming you. Deal. Mark pressed her against the car, his mouth finding hers, and for a moment Sarah felt 24 again, felt that rush of doing something reckless and wonderful. His hands tangled in her hair, and she forgot about being tired, forgot about the mortgage and the job and all the small disappointments that accumulated over a decade of marriage. That's when they heard the first sound. A soft scraping, like fingernails on metal, coming from somewhere behind the van. Mark pulled back, frowning. Did you hear that? Probably just a cat. But Sarah's voice was uncertain. The sound came again, longer this time, accompanied by a wet, shuffling noise that made her skin crawl. That's not a cat. Mark straightened, peering into the shadows. Hello? Someone there? Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the interstate and the buzz of the failing streetlight. Sarah pressed closer to Mark, suddenly very aware of how isolated they were. Then came the breathing. Not normal breathing. This was labored, thick, like someone trying to breathe through water. It rose and fell in irregular gasps, punctuated by a sound that made Sarah's stomach turn. A wet, guttural retching that seemed to go on forever. Jesus, Mark whispered. Someone's hurt. Mark, don't... But he was already moving toward the van, Sarah reluctantly following. The retching sound grew louder, more violent, accompanied now by what sounded like tearing cloth and the scrape of something being dragged across concrete. Hey, Mark called out, his voice echoing off the buildings. You okay back there? Do you need help? The sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get in the car and drive away as fast as possible. But Mark shook her off, moving around the back of the van with the determined stupidity of someone who'd grown up in a small town where the worst thing that happened was teenagers spray painting the water tower. "Mark, please!" That's when they saw it. The thing crouched behind the van might have been human once. It wore the tattered remains of what looked like a hospital gown, the fabric soaked through with fluid Sarah didn't want to identify. Its skin had a waxy gray pallor, mottled with dark veins that stood out like ink stains. Where its left arm should have been, there was only a ragged stump, still weeping something black and viscous. But it was the face that made Sarah scream. The thing's jaw hung slack, unhinged, revealing rows of teeth stained dark with blood. Its eyes had rolled back, showing only the whites, and when it breathed, a thick, ropey strand of saliva mixed with something darker dripped from its mouth to pool on the asphalt. For a moment, nobody moved. The creature's head swiveled toward them with a wet, grinding sound, like bone scraping against bone. When it tried to stand, Sarah could see that one of its legs was bent at an impossible angle, the femur jutting through the skin like a broken stick. "What the hell?" Mark started to say. The thing lunged. Despite its injuries, it moved with horrifying speed, propelling itself forward on its good leg while its mangled limbs scraped against the ground. Mark tried to backpedal, but his heel caught on a chunk of broken asphalt. He went down hard, his head cracking against the bumper of the van. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, but the creature was already on him. Its remaining hand, if it could still be called a hand, clamped down on Mark's throat with fingers that had swollen to twice their normal size, the flesh split and leaking. Mark thrashed beneath it, trying to push it away, but the thing's grip was like a vice. Then it bit him. The sound of teeth tearing through flesh was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. Mark's scream cut through the night air, raw and primal, as the creature's jaw worked at his shoulder like a dog with a bone. Blood sprayed across the asphalt in dark arterial spurts, and Sarah could hear the wet crunch of cartilage giving way. "Get off him!" She grabbed a chunk of concrete and brought it down on the thing's skull with all her strength. It made a sound like a melon hitting pavement, but the creature barely seemed to notice. If anything, the impact only made it bite down harder. Mark's struggles were getting weaker. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Sarah hit the creature again and again until their hands were slick with blood and bits of bone, but it wouldn't let go. Finally, desperately, she grabbed Mark's keys from where they'd fallen and drove them deep into the thing's eye socket. That got a reaction, a sound somewhere between a scream and a death rattle. The creature released its grip and rolled away, clawing at its ruined face. Sarah dragged Mark to his feet, or tried to. He was dead weight, his shoulder a mangled mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. Blood soaked through his shirt, running down his arm in steady streams. "Baby, come on, we have to go." She got her shoulder under his arm, half carrying him toward the car. Behind them, she could hear the creature thrashing around, making sounds like a wounded animal. Mark's breathing was shallow, rapid. When she got him into the passenger seat, she could see his pupils were dilated, his skin clammy with shock. But he was alive. He was alive, and they were going to get help. Sarah fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get them in the ignition. In the rearview mirror, she could see the creature had managed to stand again, swaying like a drunk. It took a shambling step toward the car, then another. The engine turned over on the third try. Sarah threw it in reverse, not caring that she clipped the dumpster as she backed out. The creature was close enough now that she could see its ruined face in the headlights, black fluid streaming from the socket where its eye used to be. As they pulled out of the lot, Mark made a sound, part groan, part something else. When Sarah looked at him, His head was thrown back, his body rigid with convulsions. Foam flecked with blood bubbled from his mouth. "Mark? Mark, stay with me." She floored the accelerator, racing through the empty streets toward Cullman Regional Medical Center. The speedometer climbed past 50, past 60. She blew through 2 red lights, laying on the horn. The hospital was only 8 blocks away. They'd make it. They had to make it. That's when Mark bit her. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had driven a railroad spike through her forearm. Sarah screamed and jerked the wheel hard to the right, the Honda jumping the curb and slamming into a fire hydrant with a sound like thunder. Water erupted from the broken hydrant, cascading over the windshield as Sarah tried to process what had just happened. Mark, her husband of 10 years, had his teeth buried in her arm just below the elbow. His eyes had rolled back like the creature's, showing only the whites, and when he breathed, that same wet, labored sound filled the car. "Mark, let go." She tried to pull free, but his jaw was locked tight. She could feel his teeth grinding against the bone, could feel warm blood running down her arm to drip on the floorboard. Panic gave her strength. She brought her free hand across in a wild haymaker that caught him square in the temple. His head snapped back, teeth tearing free from her arm with a wet sound that made her gag. Sarah threw herself out of the car and stumbled backward, clutching her wounded arm. Blood seeped through her fingers, and she could see the perfect impression of Mark's teeth in her flesh. Not just the incisors, but the molars too, deep enough to leave permanent scars. If she lived that long. Mark was trying to get out of the car, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The seatbelt was tangled around his neck, and he clawed at it with fingers that had started to swell and split, just like the creature in the parking lot. Sarah ran. She sprinted down Main Street in her heels, past the darkened storefronts and the Starbucks with its chairs stacked on the tables. Her arm throbbed with every step, and she could feel something warm and sticky running down to her fingertips. Behind her, she could hear glass breaking as Mark finally freed himself from the car. The police station was 6 blocks away. Sarah had never run so hard in her life, her lungs burning, her legs shaking with exhaustion and shock. She kept looking back, expecting to see Mark shambling after her, but the street behind her remained empty. Officer Danny Reeves was working the graveyard shift when Sarah burst through the front door of the Cullman PD. He'd been dozing in his chair, feet up on the desk, dreaming about fishing at Smith Lake. The sight of a blood-covered woman in a torn party dress snapped him awake faster than a pot of coffee. "Ma'am, what? You have to help me." Sarah collapsed against the desk, gasping. "My husband. Something happened to him. Something bit him, and then he—" She held up her arm, showing the perfect ring of tooth marks. "He bit me. Danny. He bit me." Danny Reeves had grown up 2 streets over from Sarah. They'd gone to high school together, though they'd never been close. He'd always thought of her as one of the good kids, the ones who went to college and came back with degrees and nice cars. Seeing her like this, wild-eyed and bleeding, was like watching his childhood burn down. "Slow down, Sarah." "What happened? Where's Mark?" She tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a rush. Danny listened, nodding, but she could see the skepticism in his eyes. A creature in the parking lot? People biting each other? It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. "Okay," he said when she finished. "Let's get that arm looked at first. Then we'll—" The radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, we've got reports of a disturbance on Main Street. Possible 10-54, vehicle versus fire hydrant. Water's everywhere." Sarah and Danny looked at each other. She could see the moment when he started to believe her. "That's my car," she whispered. Danny reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I'm en route to that 1054, and send an ambulance. We might have injured parties." "Copy that, 12. Ambulance is rolling." It took them 4 minutes to get back to Main Street. The Honda sat wrapped around the fire hydrant like a crumpled beer can, water still gushing from the broken line. The passenger door hung open, the interior soaked and empty. "Where is he?" Danny asked, one hand resting on his service weapon. "I don't know." Sarah was shivering despite the warm night air. Her arm had stopped bleeding, but it felt hot and swollen under the makeshift bandage Danny had given her. "He was right behind me." They found the first body 3 blocks away. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop lay sprawled on the sidewalk in front of the post office, still wearing her bathrobe and slippers. She'd probably been letting her cat out when she encountered whatever Mark had become. The cat lay nearby, its neck twisted at an impossible angle. Mrs. Henderson's throat had been torn open. "Jesus Christ," Danny whispered, kneeling beside the body. "What kind of animal—" "It wasn't an animal," Sarah said quietly. "It was my husband." The second body was found an hour later by the paramedics who'd come to treat Sarah's arm. Jimmy Caldwell, the night security guard at the Antique Mall, had apparently tried to investigate the disturbance in the parking lot. They found him behind the old Piggly Wiggly, his uniform torn to shreds, bite marks covering his arms and neck. But Jimmy Caldwell wasn't dead. When the paramedics tried to load him into the ambulance, his eyes snapped open, rolled back showing only the whites, and he lunged at the nearest EMT with a sound that wasn't quite human. The man's name was Rodriguez, and he'd seen 20 years of car accidents, overdoses, and domestic violence calls. But he'd never seen anything like the way Jimmy moved, the way his jaw unhinged like a snake's to reveal teeth stained black with blood. Rodriguez managed to get away, but not before Jimmy's teeth found purchase on his ankle. By 3 a.m., they had 5 more cases. Each one followed the same pattern. A normal person, bitten by someone who'd already turned, transforming into something that was no longer quite human. The change seemed to take between 30 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the severity of the bite and the victim's general health. Danny had called in the state police, and they'd set up a perimeter around downtown Coleman. But the containment was failing. Reports were coming in from surrounding neighborhoods, from the interstate, even from as far away as Decatur. It was spreading. Dr. Elizabeth Warren at Coleman Regional had seen the first few victims brought in. As the head of emergency medicine, she'd dealt with everything from heart attacks to chainsaw accidents, but she'd never seen anything like this. The infected seemed to be driven by a single, overwhelming compulsion: to bite, to spread whatever pathogen had taken control of their nervous system. She'd tried sedating the first patient, Rodriguez, the paramedic, but standard doses of Ativan and Haldol had no effect. When she'd increased the dosage to levels that should have knocked out a horse, he'd still managed to tear through the leather restraints and attack a nurse. The blood work was even more disturbing. Whatever was causing the transformation was unlike any virus or bacteria she'd ever seen. It seemed to target the nervous system directly, shutting down higher brain functions while leaving the brain stem intact. The infected could still walk, could still hunt, but everything that made them human was simply gone. And it was spreading faster than anything she'd ever seen. By dawn, the National Guard had been called in. Helicopters circled overhead, and military checkpoints blocked every road leading out of Coleman. The official story was a chemical spill at a nearby plant, something that caused violent psychotic episodes in those exposed. Sarah knew better. She sat in the police station, her arm throbbing despite the painkillers Dr. Warren had given her. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from several buildings downtown. The infection had reached the residential areas now, spreading through families, through neighborhoods, through anyone unlucky enough to encounter someone who'd already turned. "How many?" she asked Danny when he came back from his latest patrol. 43 confirmed, he said, slumping into his chair. His uniform was stained with blood and sweat, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Probably twice that many we don't know about yet." "And how many of us?" 24 cops, maybe 30 National Guard, handful of paramedics and doctors who haven't been infected yet. He rubbed his face. "Sarah, I'm not gonna lie to you. This is bad, real bad." Outside, something that had once been human shambled past the window, its hospital gown hanging in tatters. It moved with that characteristic lurching gait, pausing occasionally to sniff the air like a bloodhound following a scent. "Have you heard from Atlanta?" Sarah asked. The CDC was based there. If anyone could help them, it would be the Centers for Disease Control. "They're sending a team. Should be here by noon." Danny didn't sound hopeful. "But Sarah, what if this doesn't stay in Cullman? What if it spreads to Birmingham, to Atlanta, to—" He didn't need to finish. Sarah could see it in his eyes, the same fear that had been growing in her chest since she'd first seen that thing behind the van. This wasn't just a local outbreak. This was the beginning of the end. By 8 a.m., the local news had picked up the story. "Good morning, I'm Jessica Palmer with Channel 31 News. We begin this morning with breaking news out of Cullman County, where authorities have declared a medical emergency following what officials are calling a chemical exposure incident at an undisclosed industrial facility." The reporter stood at the military checkpoint on Highway 157, soldiers visible in the background. She looked professional, composed, but Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. Details remain sketchy, but sources tell us that dozens of residents have been hospitalized after exhibiting symptoms that include extreme aggression and apparent psychotic episodes. The Alabama National Guard has established a quarantine zone around the affected area, and residents are being advised to shelter in place until the situation can be resolved. Sarah laughed bitterly. Chemical exposure, psychotic episodes. They were still trying to explain it away, to make it fit into neat categories that wouldn't send the rest of the world into a panic. But Sarah had seen the truth. She'd looked into Mark's eyes as he bit her, had seen the complete absence of anything human. This wasn't a chemical spill or a gas leak or some kind of mass hysteria. This was something else entirely. Something worse. And it was spreading. The CDC team arrived at 11:47 a.m., 3 black SUVs escorted by military vehicles. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead epidemiologist, set up a command post in the high school gymnasium and immediately began interviewing survivors, taking blood samples, trying to understand the vector and transmission method of what was clearly a previously unknown pathogen. But by the time she arrived, it was already too late. The infection had breached the quarantine zone sometime around 10 a.m., carried by a trucker who'd stopped for gas at the Flying J just outside the perimeter. By noon, there were reports from Huntsville. By 2 p.m., Birmingham. By evening, Atlanta. The evening news was different. The anchors looked shaken, their usual polished composure cracking around the edges. The situation in Alabama continues to deteriorate as what authorities are now calling an unknown biological agent spreads beyond the initial quarantine zone. Reports are coming in from across the southeast of individuals exhibiting symptoms consistent with those first observed in Cullman County. They showed footage from Birmingham. Overturned cars, people running through the streets, smoke rising from burning buildings. The camera lingered on a group of infected shuffling through a shopping mall parking lot, their movements eerily synchronized. The president is expected to address the nation within the hour. In the meantime, authorities are urging all residents of the affected areas to remain indoors and avoid contact with anyone exhibiting signs of the infection, which includes severe disorientation, aggressive behavior, and what witnesses describe as animal-like movements. Sarah watched from the police station's break room, her arm now hot and swollen despite the antibiotics Dr. Warren had prescribed. She could feel something moving under her skin, something that shouldn't be there. When she looked in the mirror, her eyes seemed different, not rolled back like the others, not yet, but distant, unfocused. She was running out of time. By midnight, the infection had reached the East Coast. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, all reporting cases. The stock market had crashed, international flights were being canceled, and the president's address had been postponed indefinitely after 3 members of his cabinet had to be sedated and restrained. Social media was going crazy. # zombie apocalypse was trending worldwide, along with # Cullman outbreak and # end times. Videos of the infected were everywhere. Grainy cell phone footage of former humans shambling through streets, attacking anyone they could catch, spreading the infection with every bite. Religious leaders were calling it divine judgment. Conspiracy theorists blamed the government or foreign terrorists or secret experiments gone wrong. Scientists on the news tried to remain calm, talking about containment protocols and vaccine development, but Sarah could see the panic in their eyes too. This was it. This was how the world ended. Not with nuclear war or climate change or asteroid impacts, but with something as simple and primordial as one creature biting another. By 3 a.m., even the military checkpoints were falling. Sarah watched through the station window as soldiers in hazmat suits retreated from their positions, some of them stumbling with the telltale gait of the infected. How many of them had been bitten during the chaos? How many were carrying the infection to other bases, other cities? Danny hadn't come back from his last patrol. Sarah was alone in the station now, listening to the radio chatter grow more and more desperate as the net of civilization unraveled hour by hour. Reports of infrastructure failures, of power grids going down, of water treatment plants being abandoned as their operators either fled or succumbed to the infection. Outside, Cullman was burning. Sarah could see the glow of fires reflected off the low-hanging clouds, could hear the distant sounds of gunfire and screaming. Sometimes she saw shapes moving in the streets, alone or in groups, shuffling with that horrible mechanical rhythm. Once she thought she recognized one of them, a woman in a nurse's uniform, probably from the hospital. Her face was gone, torn away by teeth or fingernails, but she moved with the same purposeful hunt as the others. The radio crackled one last time around dawn. "This is General Morrison at Fort Campbell. To any military or civilian personnel still monitoring this frequency, be advised that we are implementing wildfire protocol as of 0600 hours. All remaining personnel are to evacuate to designated safe zones immediately. I repeat, wildfire protocol is now in effect. May God have mercy on us all." Sarah didn't know what wildfire protocol meant, but she could guess. When containment failed, when the infection couldn't be stopped, what was left but to burn it all down and hope something survived in the ashes? She looked at her arm. The bite marks had turned black, spreading up toward her shoulder in dark tendrils that pulsed with her heartbeat. When she touched them, she felt nothing. No pain, no sensation at all. The nerves were dying, just like her husband's had, just like everyone else's. Soon she would be like them. Soon she would be hunting through the ruins of Cullman, looking for fresh meat, spreading the infection to anyone unlucky enough to cross her path. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt nothing at all. Outside, something was moving in the sky. Sarah pressed her face to the window, trying to see through the smoke and haze. Aircraft of some kind, flying low and fast from the north. Helicopters, maybe, or number. Those were jets, military jets, flying in formation toward the center of town. Sarah smiled, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe there was hope after all. Maybe dash dash. The first explosion lit up the sky like a second sun. Then she heard it. Coming from the north, cutting through the roar of jet engines and the rumble of distant explosions, a sound that made her infected blood sing with recognition. The distinctive roar of an A-10 Warthog, its 30mm Gatling cannon spitting death at 3,900 rounds per minute. Chapter 3. Thunder Run. The sound was unmistakable, like God himself tearing a bedsheet made of thunder and lightning. Sarah had heard it once before, years ago at an air show at Maxwell Air Force Base, and it was the kind of sound that stayed with you, that vibrated in your bones long after the echoes faded. Through the police station window, she could see the A-10 Warthog screaming over Main Street at barely 300 feet, its twin engines howling like banshees. The aircraft looked like a flying tank, ugly, angular, built around that massive cannon that jutted from its nose like the finger of an angry god. The infected in the street below didn't even have time to look up. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up with a sound like the world's largest zipper being torn open at light speed. 30-millimeter rounds, each one the size of a beer bottle, hammered into the asphalt at a rate of nearly 4,000 per minute. Where they hit, the infected simply ceased to exist, vaporized by high-explosive rounds designed to punch through Soviet tank armor. What had been a shuffling horde of maybe 30 infected became a fine red mist in less than 2 seconds. "Holy shit," Sarah whispered, her infected brain still capable of wonder. The A-10 banked hard left, pulling a turn that should have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft, and came around for another pass. This time, it targeted a group of infected that had gathered around the burning Walmart, their moans lost in the roar of jet engines and exploding ordnance. More red mist, more craters in the asphalt. The infected were fast, and they were strong, and they felt no pain or fear. But they were still just flesh and blood didn't do well when hit by rounds traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Sarah could hear other jets now, F-16 and F/A-18 screaming overhead in tight formations. They weren't using their cannons. At this low altitude, in an urban environment, they were dropping precision-guided munitions, JDAMs and Hellfires, surgical strikes that could take out a single building without damaging the ones next to it. She watched in fascination as a 500-pound bomb obliterated the antique mall where this had all started. The explosion was perfectly contained, the shockwave channeled straight down into the earth. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a perfectly circular crater, and the infected who had been shambling through the ruins were gone. Just gone. From the north came a new sound. Not the scream of jet engines, but the growl of diesel motors and the clank of heavy treads on asphalt. Sarah pressed her face to the window, trying to see through the smoke. M1A2. Abrams' main battle tanks were rolling down Highway 157, their 120-millimeter smoothbore cannons trained on anything that moved. Behind them came Bradley fighting vehicles, Stryker APCs, and Humvees mounted with 50-caliber machine guns and Mk-19 grenade launchers. The full weight of the United States Army had descended on Cullman, Alabama. And they were not fucking around. The lead Abrams, Sarah could see the name Roll Tide painted on its barrel, came to a halt at the intersection of Main and 2nd. Its turret swiveled with mechanical precision, the thermal imaging system identifying targets that were invisible to the naked eye. When it found a cluster of infected holed up in the ruins of the old courthouse, it didn't hesitate. The 120-millimeter cannon spoke once. The courthouse disappeared. 68 tons of tank, powered by a 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine, can accelerate from 0 to 45 miles per hour in under 7 seconds. When that much mass hits a group of infected at full speed, the physics are simple and brutal. Sarah watched as another Abrams plowed through a pack of 20 infected like a snowplow through slush, its treads leaving nothing but stains on the asphalt. The infected fought back, of course. They swarmed the tanks like angry ants, their fingernails and teeth scraping uselessly against armor designed to withstand Russian anti-tank missiles. A few of them managed to climb onto the hulls, clawing at vision ports and trying to find some way inside. The tank crews were ready for that too. Machine guns mounted on commanders' cupolas and coaxial with the main guns opened up, the .50 caliber rounds literally tearing infected bodies apart. What the machine guns missed, the infantry got. U.S. Army Rangers, the 75th Ranger Regiment out of Fort Benning, moved through the streets in disciplined fire teams. They wore full MOPP gear, chemical protection suits that covered them from head to toe, and carried weapons Sarah had only seen in movies. M4A1 carbines with advanced optics, M249 squad automatic weapons, even a few M240 machine guns for when things got really hairy. The Rangers didn't waste ammunition. They moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had spent the last 20 years fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, identifying targets, engaging with precise, controlled bursts, then moving to the next fire position. An infected might be fast, might be strong, might feel no pain, but it couldn't dodge a 5.56mm round traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Sarah watched as a Ranger team cleared the Starbucks with textbook precision. Flashbang grenades first, to disorient any infected inside, then a smooth breach through the front door. She could hear the gunfire from inside, short, controlled bursts that spoke of professional soldiers doing what they'd been trained to do. 30 seconds later, they emerged, gave the all-clear signal, and moved on to the next building. It was like watching a video game played by experts. Clinical, efficient, absolutely merciless. The infected never had a chance. A flight of Apache attack helicopters swept in from the east, their chin-mounted 30mm chain guns spinning up with that distinctive whine that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. The Apaches didn't bother with precision. They simply hosed down entire city blocks with high-explosive rounds, turning infected into pink mist and reducing their hiding places to rubble. When the chain guns ran dry, the helicopters switched to Hellfire missiles. Sarah watched in awe as one Apache put a Hellfire through the window of the second-floor apartment where she'd seen a group of infected gathering. The building simply folded in on itself, collapsing into a neat pile of debris. No infected emerged from the rubble. From her position in the police station, Sarah had a perfect view of the systematic destruction of everything that had once threatened to end the world. Block by block, building by building, the U.S. military was erasing the infection from existence with the kind of overwhelming firepower that had made America the world's only superpower. A Bradley fighting vehicle rumbled past the police station, its 25mm chain gun tracking potential targets with mechanical precision. Sarah could see the soldiers inside through the vision ports, young men and women who looked like they were having the time of their lives. This wasn't the grinding, ambiguous warfare of Afghanistan. This was simple. Bad guys over there, good guys over here. Weapons free. Point and shoot until the bad guys stopped moving. The infected that had seemed so terrifying just hours ago. Fast, strong, relentless, impossible to reason with or stop, were being mowed down like wheat before a combine harvester. What was a zombie bite compared to a depleted uranium penetrator fired from a tank's main gun? What was inhuman strength compared to high-explosive ordnance delivered with GPS precision? Sarah realized she was laughing, though she wasn't sure if it was the infection affecting her brain or simple hysteria. All those zombie movies, all those books and TV shows about the Walking Dead overwhelming civilization through sheer numbers and unstoppable hunger. None of them had apparently considered what would happen when the zombies met the United States military at the peak of its power. It was like watching a nature documentary where the prey turned out to have thermonuclear weapons. An F-16 screamed overhead, so low Sarah could see the pilot's helmet in the cockpit. It was carrying a full load of ordnance, cluster bombs, guided missiles, enough firepower to level a small city. But it wasn't alone. She could count at least 12 other fighters in the formation, all of them loaded for bear. Where were they going? What were they going to hit that required that much firepower? The answer came 30 seconds later when the entire northern horizon lit up like the surface of the sun. Even from 20 miles away, Sarah could feel the heat on her face through the police station window. The mushroom cloud that rose into the morning sky wasn't nuclear. She'd seen enough documentaries to know the difference. But it was massive. Someone had just dropped a Moab, a massive ordnance air blast bomb, on what was probably the largest concentration of infected in the state. 21,000 pounds of high explosive, designed to clear entire city blocks, had just erased whatever remained of the infection spread toward Birmingham. Sarah checked her watch. 7:23 a.m. The zombie apocalypse had lasted exactly 9 hours and 36 minutes. A Humvee pulled up outside the police station, its machine gunner scanning for targets while 2 soldiers in full battle gear approached the front door. Sarah could hear their voices through her radio. They were using the local police frequency. "Control, this is Bravo 7. We've got a possible survivor at the police station. Building appears secure." "Copy that, Bravo 7. Rules of engagement remain in effect. If they're infected, put them down. If they're clean, tag and bag for evacuation. The soldiers entered carefully, weapons raised, moving with the fluid grace of professionals who had done this 1,000 times before. The first one through the door was a sergeant, his name tape reading Williams. He couldn't have been more than 25, but his eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with appropriate application of violence. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Williams, U.S. Army. Are you injured? Have you been bitten?" Sarah held up her arm, showing the blackened bite marks that now covered most of her forearm. "About 6 hours ago, my husband, he turned and he bit me." Williams didn't hesitate. His M4 came up to his shoulder in one smooth motion, the red dot of his laser sight centering on Sarah's forehead. "Whoa, wait!" The second soldier, a younger kid whose name tape read Martinez, put his hand on Williams's weapon. "Sarge, look at her eyes." Williams looked. Sarah's eyes were still normal, tired, traumatized, but still human. Not the rolled-back whites of the infected. "How long since you were bitten?" Williams asked, not lowering his weapon. 6 hours, maybe 7. Everyone else turned in 30 minutes to 2 hours. I don't know why I'm different. Martinez pulled out a handheld device that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a tricorder. "Control, we need a medical evaluation here. Possible immunity case." The radio crackled back immediately. "Negative Bravo 7. Orders are to eliminate all infected personnel. No exceptions." Williams's finger moved to the trigger. "Wait," Sarah said quietly. "Before you shoot me, can I ask you something?" "Make it fast, ma'am. How long did it take you to get here?" "To organize all this?" She gestured toward the window where another formation of jets was screaming overhead. Williams glanced at Martinez, then back at Sarah. "Orders came down at 0200. We were wheels up from Benning by 0300. 3 hours, Sarah said wonderingly. 3 hours from the first reports to full military response. Ma'am, the United States military has contingency plans for everything, including this. Including zombies? Including Class 4 biological outbreaks with hostile reanimated vectors. Yes, ma'am. We call it Operation Dead Stop. Been in the playbook since 2003. Sarah started laughing again, that same hysterical edge creeping into her voice. You had a plan. You actually had a plan for the zombie apocalypse. Ma'am, we have plans for everything. Alien invasion, Yellowstone supervolcano, robot uprising, you name it. The Pentagon's job is to think of worst-case scenarios and figure out how to blow them up. And this worked out pretty well for you, didn't it? Williams allowed himself a small smile. Ma'am, with respect, your zombies picked a fight with the most powerful military force in human history. They brought teeth and fingernails to a gunfight with tanks, helicopters, and air support. It was never going to end well for them. Through the window, Sarah could see cleanup crews moving through the streets. Not soldiers now, but specialists in hazmat suits, checking bodies, taking samples, making sure nothing was left alive that shouldn't be. A few buildings were still burning, but the gunfire had stopped. The screaming had stopped. Cullman, Alabama was quiet for the first time in 10 hours. Control, this is Colonel Morrison. A new voice came over the radio, calm and professional. Operation Dead Stop is complete. Total infected eliminated, approximately 2,847. Military casualties, 0. Civilian casualties, 1,205 killed in action, 23 wounded, 347 evacuated. Containment, 100% effective. No spread beyond the designated kill zone. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. 1,200 people died. Yes, ma'am, Williams said quietly. But 6 billion didn't. Sometimes that's the best you can do. Martinez's scanner beeped. Sarge, her blood work is coming back negative for active infection. Whatever bit her, it didn't take. Williams finally lowered his weapon. Lucky you, ma'am. Lucky me, Sarah repeated numbly. Outside, a convoy of military vehicles was rolling through downtown Cullman, carrying scientists and medical personnel who would spend the next months figuring out exactly what had happened, where the infection had come from, and how to make sure it never happened again. The bodies would be incinerated, the buildings decontaminated, the whole area quarantined until they were absolutely certain nothing was left. Within a year, there would be a small memorial park where the antique mall had been. The official story would be a terrorist attack with an experimental biological weapon, quickly contained by rapid military response. Most of the world would never know how close they'd come to a real zombie apocalypse. But Sarah would know. She'd know that when push came to shove, when humanity faced its darkest nightmare, the response hadn't been panic or despair or the collapse of civilization. It had been 3 hours of planning, followed by 6 hours of the most efficient military operation in human history. The zombie apocalypse was over. It had never really stood a chance. Epilogue. 6 months later. Dr. Sarah Chen's final report on the Cullman incident ran to 847 pages, but the executive summary was only 3 paragraphs long. The pathogen responsible for the Cullman outbreak appears to have been a previously unknown prion-based biological agent, possibly of artificial origin. Initial infection vectors suggest intentional deployment, though the perpetrator remains unknown. The agent caused rapid degradation of higher brain functions while leaving brainstem activity intact, resulting in extremely aggressive behavior in affected subjects. Military response was swift and effective. The implementation of Operation Dead Stop protocols contained the outbreak within 9.6 hours of first contact, with 0 spread beyond the designated kill zone. The combination of air power, armor, and infantry proved overwhelmingly effective against infected targets. Recommendation: continue development of rapid response protocols for similar incidents. The Cullman outbreak demonstrates that while biological weapons may pose a significant initial threat, they remain vulnerable to conventional military force when deployed with appropriate speed and overwhelming firepower. Sarah Thompson read the report from her hospital bed at the CDC in Atlanta, where she'd spent the last 6 months being poked, prodded, and studied by the best medical minds in the country. They still didn't know why she'd been immune, why the infection that had turned her husband and 2,800 other people into monsters had simply stopped working in her bloodstream. They probably never would. But she was alive, and the world was still turning, and somewhere in Alabama they were already breaking ground on a new Starbucks to replace the one that had been blown up by an Apache helicopter. Life, as it turned out, went on, even after the zombies. The end.